In the murky shadows of Jersey's underbelly, Richard Kuklinski's life was a labyrinth of violence and betrayal. They found his teeth before they found his name, the detective murmured, flipping through the cold case files. His expression was grim as he stared at the evidence. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that shocked him, it was the silence that surrounded it. A man who was a ghost. A man whose violence was more calculated than any mob boss. Behind his cold eyes, Kuklinski didn't fear death. He was its harbinger, and that made him a weapon, lethal and undetected. The world had no idea that the quiet family man was also the most feared killer on the streets. "They think I'm just another soldier, just another hired gun," Richard whispered to himself as he sharpened his blade. "But I'm not." In the back of his mind, something shifted, his loyalty now tied to power, not family. Kuklinski sat alone in his apartment, a place he rarely used. The dim glow of his desk lamp illuminated his monstrous yet calculating face. The phone rang. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew it was someone from the family, but he wasn't interested. They were all expendable. He was the Iceman after all. He didn't work for anyone, he worked for himself, at least that's what he told himself every day. The mob. They had made him who he was, but they didn't own him. He wasn't a piece of their puzzle. As he stared at the reflection in his window, the cold truth gnawed at him. He wasn't born to live this way. He had his own twisted idea of justice, one where death was just another transaction. The knock on his door was sharp, sudden, and as expected. He didn't move. He had been waiting for it. "You're late," he muttered as the door creaked open. The messenger stood there, hands trembling, a slight fear in his posture. He knew this was business, but he didn't want to be the one delivering the news. "The boss needs you. Something big is happening," the man said, eyes darting nervously. Richard didn't respond at first. His cold, unwavering gaze met the messenger's. "I'm not interested in what the boss needs," Kuklinski replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm interested in what I need." The man shuffled nervously before leaving, his boots echoing in the silence. Richard's hand slowly reached for the gun under his jacket. Something told him tonight wouldn't end quietly. In the grimy alleyways of the city, Kuklinski made his move. The deal was simple: get in, get the cash, and leave. But nothing was ever that easy. As he approached the meeting point, he noticed the others, the rival crew, waiting. They were out of their league. Richard grinned darkly. He was a wolf among sheep, and he knew it. "Where's the money?" one of them asked, trying to sound tough. Richard's lips twisted in amusement. "Money. It's not the money that's important." His voice dropped low, almost whispering. "It's the message." Their shot echoed in the alley. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Richard moved with precision, a methodical dance of death. The aftermath was always the same: bodies, blood, and silence. The city's rats would scurry and whisper, but they didn't know. They never knew. He was too careful, too efficient. Richard stood over the body, his boots tapping the wet pavement as he took a drag from his cigarette. The sky above was a void, the clouds thick and suffocating, much like the life he had chosen. "Not even a thank you," he muttered, crushing the cigarette beneath his heel. But that was how it worked. It wasn't about gratitude, it was about power. And Kuklinski had all the power he needed. No one crossed him and lived to tell the tale. Richard Kuklinski had always prided himself on being an enigma, untraceable, a shadow in the night. But tonight was different. A new player had entered the game, and this one wasn't afraid to make noise. The muffled sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, a familiar symphony that he'd learned to drown out. But there was something about tonight that gnawed at him. As he stood on the rooftop overlooking the city, his eyes flickered toward the flickering lights of the alley below. There was a new crew making a name for themselves. Young, reckless, and disorganized. He knew they were making a move to dethrone the older guard. Richard smiled grimly. They didn't know what they were up against. He didn't like the idea of competition, but he had a message to deliver, one that no one would forget. It was a warning wrapped in death, a warning these fools wouldn't survive. "I'm not here to fight for control," he muttered to himself. "I'm here to remind them who's in charge." Richard's instincts were razor sharp, and tonight, they screamed at him. He descended from the rooftop and moved swiftly through the narrow alleys, his steps echoing in the stillness. The smell of wet pavement and oil mixed with the acrid scent of blood. He could sense them before he saw them, the new players, just as he expected. 3 men stood near a corner, discussing something in hushed voices. Richard approached, making no effort to hide his presence. One of them turned, their eyes widening in surprise. "What the hell are you doing here?" one of them asked, his voice shaky. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his cold eyes locking onto theirs. He could see the fear now, unmistakable in their expressions. These boys had no idea who they were dealing with. Without warning, he drew his weapon and fired. One of them collapsed instantly. The other 2 fumbled for their guns, but it was too late. Kuklinski was already upon them. The sound of gunshots shattered the night air, and the alley fell silent. Richard stood over the bodies, his breathing slow and controlled. The blood pooled around the men like a dark promise. He didn't feel satisfaction, he never did. It was just another job, another message. He knelt down to examine their faces, cold and lifeless, and he felt nothing. "This is what happens when you don't respect the rules," he muttered, wiping the blood from his hands. The city had a way of spitting out its own, and these men were no exception. Richard turned and walked away, his steps steady as he disappeared into the shadows once more. He wasn't finished yet. The message needed to be delivered to the ones who truly mattered, the ones who had started this game. It was time for them to learn who the real player was. Richard's reputation was growing, as was the tension between the old guard and the new. Word had spread fast about the message he had delivered in the alley, and now the mob bosses were beginning to take notice. But Richard wasn't interested in their praise. He wasn't in it for the recognition or the power. He was in it for control. The rules of the game were simple. You either played or you didn't. And those who didn't play, well, they ended up like the men in the alley. A figure stepped out of the shadows, a familiar face. "You've made a lot of noise lately, Richard," the man said, his voice tinged with both respect and fear. Richard turned, his expression unreadable. "I don't make noise," he replied coldly. "I make sure people listen." The man nodded slowly, the weight of Kuklinski's words settling in. Richard was no longer just a hired hand. He was a force of nature, and it was clear he wasn't going anywhere. Richard's phone rang. He didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. He never answered the phone, he didn't need to. His reputation preceded him. But tonight, he picked up. "Richard, we need to talk." The voice on the other end was one he had heard many times before. It was the voice of someone who thought they could control him. "I don't talk unless it's on my terms," Richard replied, his tone cold and unforgiving. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a nervous laugh. "You've been making waves. The old crew wants a meeting. They think you're getting too big for your boots." Richard's smile was dark. "Let them think what they want. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to end them." He hung up, his mind already moving to the next step in his plan. The game was changing, and Richard was at the center of it. As the days blurred into nights, Richard found himself deeper in a game he could no longer control. His reputation had spread like wildfire through the underworld, but with that notoriety came a new set of dangers. The old crew wanted to talk, wanted to figure out what he was doing, and they wanted to make sure he understood his place. But Richard wasn't the same man they had once known. He had risen from the shadows, become something more, and the rules had changed. He wasn't going to kneel. The call came from a man he hadn't heard from in years. A familiar voice, but with an edge now. "Richard, you've made your point, but this isn't your game." Richard's response was a cold, sharp chuckle. "It never was," he muttered to himself as he clicked off the phone. The mob had thought they could control him, but they had no idea what he had become. He was no longer just a soldier. He was the weapon. And soon they would all feel the heat of his fury. The meeting was set, but the tension was palpable. The warehouse on the edge of town had been chosen for its seclusion, quiet, distant from prying eyes. Richard arrived early, his mind sharp and calculating. He had no intention of letting the old crew think they had any power over him. They would soon learn that the world they had once controlled was now his to destroy. As he waited in the silence of the warehouse, the heavy footsteps of the approaching men echoed through the hall. The door creaked open, and several of his old associates stepped into the dim light. They were wary but confident, as if they still held some semblance of control over him. Richard's cold gaze met theirs, unflinching. He didn't need to say anything. The message had already been delivered. "You've made a mistake," Richard said quietly, his voice as cold as steel. "Now you'll pay for it." The words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. The men in the room tried to mask their discomfort with forced confidence, but it was clear they were afraid. They had underestimated Richard, assumed he was just a tool they could use for their gain. But now, the balance had shifted. Richard was no longer the man they could control. The air in the room grew thick with tension as Richard moved toward them, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You think you can push me around?" Richard said, his voice dangerously calm. "You think you can walk into my world and tell me what to do?" The silence that followed was deafening. None of them spoke, none of them dared to challenge him. With one fluid motion, Richard pulled a gun from his coat. The men froze, their eyes wide with fear, knowing they had reached the point of no return. Richard raised the gun slowly, his hand steady as he aimed it at the man closest to him. "I don't need anyone," he whispered. "Not anymore." The next few moments passed in a blur of chaos and gunfire. Richard's cold demeanor didn't waver as he methodically dealt with each of the men. He was a machine, each shot calculated, every movement precise. They didn't stand a chance. When the last of them hit the floor, the sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound left in the room. Richard took a moment, his breathing slow and controlled, his eyes scanning the carnage around him. He wasn't afraid of what he had just done. There was no guilt, no remorse. There was only the feeling of power, the sense of domination that came from taking control of a world that had once been ruled by fear. He turned and walked out of the warehouse, leaving the bodies behind. He had done what he needed to do. The message had been sent. Now, it was time to move forward. The aftermath was quiet, almost surreal. Richard walked back into the city, his steps steady as he navigated the empty streets. The world around him seemed to have frozen in time, as if it was waiting for him to make his next move. But Richard wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking about the power he now held. The old guard had been eliminated, their legacy shattered. And in their place, Richard stood, uncontested, unstoppable. He had no loyalty to anyone but himself, and the world was his to reshape. He had taken down the men who thought they could control him, and in doing so, had made a statement to everyone who doubted him. There was no going back. He was no longer a player in the game. He was the game. And the city? It would soon learn that Richard Kuklinski wasn't just a man. He was the end. Richard sat at the edge of his bed, his mind running in circles. The weight of his actions, the killings, the betrayal, was starting to settle in. But there was no room for regret. He had never been the type of man to question his choices. The phone rang, piercing the silence. It was a number he didn't recognize, but Richard had learned to trust his instincts. Without hesitation, he picked up. "It's time," the voice on the other end said. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. He had heard that tone before, calm, calculating, and ruthless. It was the kind of voice that demanded obedience, the kind of voice that came from the very top of the food chain. "Tell me what to do," Richard said, his voice steady. The silence on the other end stretched before the voice finally spoke again. "We're done with the old guard. You're taking over now. It's your turn to lead." The finality of the words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Richard stood outside the meeting place, a secluded, run-down warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He had made his decision, and now the world would follow. The old guard, the ones who thought they could control him, had been toppled. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about power, control, and carving his name into the underworld. As he approached the warehouse, the weight of the moment hit him. This was the point of no return. Once he entered, there was no going back. He pushed the door open, and inside, several men sat around a table, their faces grim. The leader, a man with years of experience in the game, looked up as Richard entered. "I didn't expect you to come here," the man said, his voice laced with disbelief. Richard's cold gaze met his. "You didn't think I would?" The man stood slowly, his eyes calculating. "We don't just hand over control, Kuklinski." Richard smiled, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Then we'll see who hands over what." The room was thick with tension. Richard stood at the center, his posture unwavering as the old guard sized him up. They had no idea what they were up against. The leader, the man who had once held power over him, stepped forward. His voice was laced with condescension. "You think you can just walk in here and take over?" the man sneered. Richard's eyes never left his expression unwavering. "I don't have to take anything. I'm already here. I already have everything." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, and the room grew silent. Richard didn't flinch. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He was the one in charge. "I've learned one thing," Richard continued. "Loyalty is earned, not given, and I don't have to ask for it." Before anyone could respond, Richard moved. Fast, precise, deadly. The first man fell before he even knew what hit him. The rest of the men scrambled, but it was too late. Richard had already claimed the power they had taken for granted. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The power struggle had been resolved in a matter of seconds, but Richard knew this was just the beginning. The room was littered with bodies, the once dominant men of the old guard lying lifeless at his feet. Richard stood over them, his cold gaze sweeping across the carnage. The blood that pooled around him was a testament to his control, his ability to command fear without ever lifting a finger. "Power is never handed to you," Richard muttered, his voice low. "You take it, you earn it, and then you keep it." He turned, his steps slow and measured, as he walked away from the bodies. He had reached the top, but now the real challenge was beginning. The world was watching, and Richard would make sure they never forgot who he was. Richard sat in his new office, the city sprawling beneath him. The view from his window was breathtaking, but he didn't care about the beauty of it. The power he had fought for was now his, but it came at a cost. The walls of the office were adorned with the symbols of his success: mob ties, blood-stained contracts, and a throne built from fear. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone rang once more. This time, it was someone he didn't recognize. "They're talking about you," the voice on the other end said. Richard remained silent, the weight of the words settling in. He had taken everything, but the real question was whether he could keep it. "I don't care what they say," Richard replied. "They'll learn who's in charge. They'll learn soon enough." The phone clicked off, and Richard stared out over the city, the streets below now under his control. This was only the beginning. The world hadn't seen anything yet. Richard stood at the top of his empire, but with the view came the weight of responsibility. The city, once a playground for those who could afford to bleed, was now under his control. But with this power came enemies, hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The phone calls were getting louder, the whispers more dangerous. The old guard had been silent for too long. Richard knew what that meant. As he sat alone in his office, the weight of the silence became suffocating. The walls were closing in on him, and no matter how much control he exerted, there were always cracks waiting to break open. His hand hovered over the glass of whiskey, the amber liquid almost taunting him. Power wasn't enough. He wanted more. The knock on the door was soft, but Richard's instincts told him it was important. The man entered, his expression tense. "They're making their move," the man said, his voice low. Richard didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. "Let them come," he said coldly, his eyes narrowing. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard made his way through the maze of empty streets. His mind was sharp, calculating every possible outcome. The old guard, the ones who had once ruled with iron fists, were beginning to fight back. It wasn't just about control anymore. It was about survival. As Richard walked, the weight of his decisions pressed down on him. He had turned the world upside down to get to this point, but he wasn't foolish enough to think it would be easy to keep. He arrived at the meeting point, an old warehouse on the edge of the city. The door was open just enough for him to slip through, unnoticed. Inside, a handful of men were waiting, their faces tense with the understanding that this was no ordinary meeting. Richard's gaze swept over them, cold and calculating. "We don't have time for pleasantries," Richard said, his voice steady. "Either you stand with me, or you fall." Inside the warehouse, the tension was unbearable. Richard stood across from the group of men, their faces grim and full of uncertainty. They were the remnants of the old guard, the ones who had once called the shots, but now they were standing in front of him, afraid of the storm he had become. "You think we'll just bend to your will?" one of them said, his voice shaky. Richard's expression remained cold, unreadable. "I'm not asking," he replied, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't have a choice." There was a moment of silence before Richard's hand moved, swift and sure. The gun was in his hand before anyone could react, and the first shot rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. The others froze, panic flashing across their faces. They had underestimated him, and now it was too late. Richard had made his move. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Richard didn't look back as he walked out of the warehouse, leaving the chaos behind him. The men who had once ruled the city were now nothing more than bodies scattered across the floor. He had done what was necessary, but even in victory, there was a sense of emptiness. The world had been reshaped in his image, but Richard knew there would always be someone else willing to challenge him. The phone rang again, and for a moment, Richard hesitated before picking it up. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it was colder now, harder. "You've made your mark, Richard," the voice said. "But the game's not over." Richard smiled faintly, his eyes narrowing. "It never is." Richard sat in his office once more, his eyes cold as he stared out over the city. The game had changed, but he wasn't done yet. He had made enemies, and in this world, that was always the beginning of the end. But he wasn't afraid. He had fought his way to the top, and he would fight to stay there. Phone rang again, this time more urgently. "Richard, it's time," the voice on the other end said. "The people you've crossed are making their move. They want revenge." Richard's lips curled into a smirk. He had always known this day would come. But he was ready. "I'll be waiting," he said calmly. "Let them come. They'll learn that I'm not as easy to break as they think." The call ended, and Richard's gaze remained fixed on the city below. The world was still his, but the price of that power was higher than he had ever imagined. Richard sat in his office, the city lights blinking in the distance, but his mind was miles away. The phone calls had stopped, the threats had subsided. The storm that had once raged was now eerily calm. Richard had thought he had it all: power, control, respect. But now, in the silence, he felt something more dangerous: doubt. His empire was built on blood, and the more he tried to convince himself that he had done it all for the right reasons, the more it felt hollow. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to fill a void that could never be filled. The knock at the door broke his reverie. He glanced at the clock. It was late, too late for a routine visit. He stood slowly, preparing for whatever this new challenge was. The door creaked open, and the familiar face of an old ally stepped into the room. "They're here," the man said simply. "They're ready to end this." Richard's jaw clenched. It was time to face the consequences. He had no choice but to confront them, to see how far he had truly fallen. The streets outside were wet from the evening rain, the sound of water dripping from gutters the only noise that broke the silence. Richard stood in front of the same warehouse where it all began. It felt like a lifetime ago. The faces he saw now were those of former allies, men he had once trusted, men who had once sworn loyalty to him. Now, those same men had come to collect. "This is how it ends, huh?" Richard muttered to himself, the irony of it all sinking in. He had built his empire on loyalty, and now, loyalty was what was coming to kill him. He had expected this, of course. But that didn't make it any easier. "You're not getting out of this alive," one of the men sneered. Richard looked around, his gaze cold. "If you want to kill me, come do it." The room was still, every man waiting for the first move. Richard's eyes flickered to the door, knowing the inevitable was drawing near. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was suffocating. The old wooden beams creaked as the wind howled through cracks in the walls. Richard's presence filled the space, heavy with the weight of what had come to this: betrayal, confrontation, the end of an era. The men circled him like wolves, but Richard was no longer the same man they once knew. He was the predator now. "You really think this will end any different?" Richard asked, his voice a low growl. "You're alone," one of them spat. "No one's coming to save you." Richard smirked, his hand instinctively brushing against the gun holstered beneath his coat. "You were always too slow. It's why you lost." A shot rang out, and the man who had spoken crumpled to the floor. Richard's movements were a blur, quick, precise. He had seen this betrayal coming from miles away. He wasn't going to let it end like this. The fight unfolded quickly as expected. Richard moved with precision, his every action deliberate. Gunshots rang out, bodies fell, but Richard didn't flinch. He had been in worse situations. He had made it this far, and he would survive this too. But as the last man fell to the ground, something unexpected happened. A voice came from behind him. "It's over, Richard." Richard turned slowly, his heart pounding. The voice belonged to someone he thought was an ally. Someone who had been with him since the beginning. "You?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You sold me out?" The man's face was hard, his eyes empty. "I did what I had to do. You've outlived your usefulness." The final betrayal was the one that stung the most, and Richard's jaw tightened. "I should have known," he said softly. The man raised his gun, aiming directly at Richard's chest. "It's over." Richard stood, his body bleeding, his strength failing him. The gunshot had been clean, but he had survived worse. His mind raced as he stumbled towards the door, each step slower than the last. He wasn't ready to die, not yet, not like this. The betrayal had cut deep, but there was still fire inside him, a fire that refused to go out. He could feel the darkness closing in. But Richard wouldn't go quietly. As he reached the exit, he turned, locking eyes with his betrayer one last time. "You'll regret this," Richard said, his voice hoarse but firm. The man didn't respond, his expression unreadable. With one final effort, Richard pushed open the door and stepped into the night, his world crashing down around him. He was still alive, still breathing, but everything had changed. The power he once held had slipped through his fingers like sand. Now, he was nothing more than a ghost. The city was silent as Richard limped through the dark streets, his blood mingling with the rain that soaked his clothes. His world had been shattered. His empire, once built on fear and loyalty, was now in ruins. He had no allies left, no power to cling to. The only thing he had now was his name, but even that was a fading echo. As he stumbled forward, the world around him felt distant, as though he was walking through a dream, a nightmare he couldn't escape. Every step was a reminder of how far he had fallen, of the choices he had made. But there was something else there, something burning in his chest. It wasn't over. Not yet. He reached a quiet alley and paused, staring at the ground beneath him. A flash of memories passed through his mind, of family, of friends who had betrayed him. But in that moment, he realized one thing: loyalty was a lie. He couldn't trust anyone. Richard clenched his fists. It wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Richard walked for hours, not knowing where he was headed, only knowing he couldn't stop. The city, once vibrant and alive with the noise of power, now felt like a hollow shell. His every step seemed to echo through the empty streets, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. The phone had been silent for weeks, no one reaching out, no one looking for him. The world had forgotten him, but he hadn't forgotten the world. The city was his. It was always meant to be his. He found himself standing at the edge of the docks, the fog rolling in from the water. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of wood, the soft lapping of water against the piers. He stood there for a long time, the weight of the past pressing down on him. Was it all for nothing? In that moment, Richard realized that revenge was no longer his goal. His only focus now was survival. He would rebuild. He would take what was rightfully his, and this time, no one would stand in his way. Richard stood at the precipice, the night air cold against his skin. The city behind him was both familiar and distant, like a part of him he had abandoned long ago. He could hear footsteps behind him, faint at first, then growing louder. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. "You've come to finish what you started?" Richard asked, without looking back. The figure stepped closer, a dark silhouette against the night. "I came to make sure you didn't forget where you came from." Richard's heart skipped a beat. It was the voice of the past, the voice of someone he had once trusted. "Don't make me laugh," Richard said, his voice low but steady. "You think you can control me now?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing a face Richard knew all too well. It was the man who had once been his right hand, the man who had abandoned him. "You've got nothing left, Richard. It's time to let go." Richard's eyes burned with cold fury. "You'll regret that," he growled. The confrontation was inevitable. Words were exchanged, but neither man was willing to back down. Richard's eyes locked onto his betrayers, the fury in them like a storm waiting to break. The air crackled with tension. "I'm done with you," Richard spat, his voice full of venom. "You don't get to walk away from this," the man replied, his tone final. Without another word, Richard's hand moved, faster than the eye could follow. The gun was in his hand, and the shot rang out before the man could even react. The silence that followed was deafening. The man fell to the ground, blood pooling at his feet. Richard stood over him, his chest heaving, eyes burning with rage. "This is my city," Richard whispered. "And you've lost." He turned away, the weight of his decision settling heavily in his chest. There was no redemption, no victory in this. Only survival. Richard walked away from the docks, the fog swallowing the sounds of his footsteps. The city behind him was a graveyard of memories, and he was the last one left standing. He wasn't sure what had driven him to survive, what kept him going through the endless betrayals and bloodshed. Maybe it was power, or maybe it was something deeper. But in that moment, as he walked alone through the empty streets, Richard knew one thing for certain: there was no turning back. He had destroyed everything, and now, he would rebuild it all. The city would belong to him again, and this time there would be no one to stop him. Richard Kuklinski was dead. Long live the Iceman. As the night closed in around him, he took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. He had nothing left to lose.